Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. The United States recording an all-time high for new coronavirus cases this week as infections in the South and the West continue to rise. These flare-ups leading the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut to announce a mandatory 14-day quarantine for visitors from the hardest hit states, and causing some states, including Texas, Arizona, and North Carolina, to announce a pause in their reopening plans. So are new lockdowns coming, and will they help stop the surge? Former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson has been looking at the data, and he's the author of Unreported Truths about COVID-19 and lockdowns. Welcome. Good to have you with us. So you see this outbreak again across the South and the West. I guess the question is, did these states reopen too soon?
Well, if they reopened too soon, it's a little odd because they reopened most of them towards the beginning of May, and throughout May, very little changed. And now all of a sudden, sort of starting in early June, and it's accelerated through June, there's a huge spike in positive tests,
right,
in these states. And so if ending the lockdowns are what caused this to happen, why didn't it happen in May and not June? And that's a very good question, which I don't think we have the answer to right now, but it's also a question that the media is not really asking.
Well, do you have any speculation yourself about why that is? I mean, where are they coming from? You see them in Houston, San Antonio, for example, Miami-Dade,
Sure.
Maricopa County, on the border in Arizona.
Sure. So, look, one theory that has been thrown out, and there is some actual statistical evidence for this, is that June has been very hot in the Sun Belt states. I mean, it's typically hot in South Texas and in Arizona, and that's driven people back indoors and driven them to use a lot of air conditioning, and so there may be some real community spread from that. Clearly, people this month became more comfortable going out and going to congregate settings like bars and restaurants, and that may also be driving some of the spread. Here, also, there's another thing that's happened, which is there's more testing in hospitals right now for people with elective surgery. There's also testing, the states have gotten better at testing people in congregate settings, like migrant workers in dormitories and stuff like that, where there's a huge amount of asymptomatic spread. Here's the most crucial fact about this right now. Cases have gone up. Positive tests, okay, that which the media refers to in general as cases, have gone up spectacularly now in the last 2 weeks. I don't think anybody can argue that. But what has also happened is there's been this disconnect between positive tests leading to hospitalizations and hospitalizations leading to deaths. So the number of deaths that these states are reporting, these three big Sunbelt states, which have about 60 million people total, really has not changed in the last 2 months. It was actually down a little bit towards the end of May, early June. It's kind of back up a little bit to where it was in May, but it's nothing like the rise in cases. So one thing we know more than anything else about COVID, I would say the one fact we know about COVID is that deaths and risk are incredibly stratified by age. Right. It's just the fact that older people are at much, much greater. It's not by a factor of 2 or 5 or even 10. If you're over 80 compared to somebody who's in their 30s or 40s, your risk is 100 times or higher that you will die from this.
Right.
And we know that many of the new cases are in young people.
All right, that's right. And the average age of those who test positive is falling. I think it's fallen in a couple of months from 65 in Florida down to 35 or so yes. in Florida. And that's good news in the sense that it means that the people who are testing positive are less vulnerable on average. But here's the concern. If these young people are going into bars and so on, in congregate settings and getting it, they're going to come and meet grandpa, greet grandma, come in with the parents. If they're still living at home, as a lot of young people do nowadays, they're going to spread to more vulnerable populations.
I mean, there certainly is some risk of that. In positive tests, cases in older people are starting to rise a little bit. They're not rising nearly as much as they are among young people. And to me, that's the real concern. But I would say this. This idea that the nursing home population is extremely vulnerable to people, to changes in the general population is unfortunately not that true. It's more true that nursing home workers can come in and spread this. But how often does a 25-year-old go to a nursing home? For better or worse, the answer is not that frequently. And what we saw in New York, what we saw in the northeastern states that had the terrible death counts, back in March and April is that the lockdowns did not protect people in nursing homes. What we saw is that if you want to protect people in nursing homes, you have to take steps to protect those settings, that a general lockdown does not help. And I make one other really important point about the lockdowns, which is if it's air conditioning that's driving this, if it's people being forced back into their homes or choosing to go back into their homes because it's so hot that's driving this, then, on some level, that sort of says, again, that lockdowns may not be a great strategy because those are people who are inside all the time now, and the air is being recirculated. Most air conditioning HVAC units do not, bring in new air constantly because it's too expensive to cool it. So that would not be an argument in favor of lockdowns.
Okay, so some of the, I guess some of the state governors are now pausing the lockdowns. They're closing bars or at least some kind of service in bars. Does that strike you as a kind of prudential move that would help to slow the spread?
I think that's prudent. I mean, Florida, as of Friday, saw 9,000 new cases. That's a big number. That's a number that's going to catch people's attention. Frankly, people are probably going to get a little bit scared and pull back on their own.
Right.
But yeah, if you want to say, hey, maybe this is not the weekend to have 200 people in a crowded bar. Let's figure out what's going on. Let's see if that gap between cases and hospitalizations and deaths continues as we would like it to, and the deaths, and hospitalizations don't take off. I think it's prudent to take some steps, but the idea that we should go back to where we were, in April in New York City or Spain or these hard lockdowns, right. I think there's not a lot of evidence for that.
All right, Alex Berenson, thanks very much for being here and paying attention to all this. Still ahead, police reform stalls in the Senate as Democrats block debate on a Republican proposal. Our panel weighs in on the politics behind that move next.
Instead of going